Chuckleinik. I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years in the classroom, I tried to bring history to life for my students by dressing the part for any time period we were studying and having them listen to the music of the time and look at the art and handle artifacts, some of which may have been authentic, some of which were replicas, just so that history would become more tangible to them, more alive, rather than just a list of famous dead people. And I'm no longer in the classroom after 36 years, so what I'm doing is I'm repurposing myself and hitting the road, and I'm on a very pretentious sounding mission Odyssey where I plan to visit each of the missions in Alta California and each of the asistencias. Those were the spin-off missions intended to become full-grown missions. Each of the estancias I could find record of, and those would be the ranches that were to help support the mission in their mission of growing food, and each of the presidios. That is where the soldados de cuerda, or the leather jacket soldiers, were stationed in order to protect Spain's interests and later Mexico's interests. So what I'm doing today, because I talk too much, is I'm headed back towards Mission San Luis Obispo to continue telling its story. And I hope you stick with me. When looking at the Spanish era of Alta California, it's very easy to just focus on the missions themselves and hugging the coast and tending to not get much beyond that. But the Spanish had a very strategic plan for controlling Alta California. It involved establishing the pueblos, or towns. It involved establishing the presidios to guard Spanish interests, as well as the 21 missions. And it involved explorers determining where these sites are going to be. So what I'm doing right now is I'm following the footsteps of another explorer, Pedro Fages. And he'd been along on the Portola expeditions, and those are the areas that were marked in red on the map. Well, Fages, he ends up doing some other explorations, and one of them does relate to Mission San Luis Obispo. And what he ended up doing is he traveled up the Cajon Pass and through the upper desert, and I think he kind of hugged the mountains, basically along the route where the 138 is right now. Then he went into, or across the Antelope Valley, up into the Lake Hughes area, and then he went up the Cajon Pass. Okay. Well, what's kind of important to Mission San Luis Obispo is later on, after he drops down into the San Joaquin Valley, he explores an area called Buena Vista Lake, which isn't really much of a lake anymore. It's kind of two little lakes and a dry lake bed. But that's going to become important to the mission a little later on. In 1798, the very colorful Padre Luis Antonio Martinez arrived at Mission San Luis Obispo. He stayed for 34 years and was the primary architect of the mission prosperity. During his time, it was noted for its wines, olive oil, fruits, and vegetables. He didn't always get along with the civil authorities. He was apparently not a very political person who instead told things like he saw them. The novel Ramona even has a story about Padre Martinez, which says that one day an important Mexican general and his bride were visiting. To entertain them, Padre Martinez arranged a parade of all the poultry at the mission, enough to last an hour. So there's a reason why I mentioned the 1772 Pedro Fages expedition, traveling through the different passes and stopping here at what used to be a much larger Lake Buena Vista before moving on to Mission San Luis Obispo. There's one connection to the mission. Now we jump forward in time to 1816 and to get a little bit of an insight into recruitment for the missions. Padre Martinez of Mission San Luis Obispo came out this way, and he attempted to bargain with the Yokuts for, basically he wanted children. He wanted children to take back to the mission. And he managed to get one for the price, and that was the way I read it in more than one source, the price of some beads, some blankets, and some other gifts. That says a lot. Okay. But Padre Martinez wasn't the only one. In 1804, Padre Martin of Mission San Miguel also explored the inland area. He baptized some people, but he was unsuccessful in trying to get recruits and trying to get children to come to the mission. And just to get a little more insight into the Spanish trying to get the native Californians into the mission system, in 1815 there was a large expedition that went into the same area, and their mission was to hunt down runaways and bring them back. It was a large expedition. At the end of that expedition, they brought back 9. So just a little insight into recruitment. Situated in the fertile, well-watered Valley of the Bears, fed by San Luis Obispo Creek, the mission produced an abundance of crops and 2 water-powered grist mills processed foods normally ground by hand. The population, around 832 in 1804, tended to crops and herds. Over the years, San Luis Obispo produced bushels of wheat, barley, corn, beans, peas, and lentils. Padre Martinez even cultivated cotton, from which garments for the neophytes were manufactured. Despite its relatively small population, it had the 4th highest production of wheat in the entire chain. The mission also had grape arbors within the mission quadrangle, and there was a garden in the northeast corner. Mission wine was sold to the other missions when they couldn't grow their own. It was even exported as far as England and Russia. San Luis Obispo had a relatively stable livestock herd during its years as a mission and made good use of the estancias, with twice as many sheep as cattle in most years. Those hides and the tallow that were produced on the lands of Mission San Luis Obispo and on the several estancias and also Estancia Santa Margarita were shipped from Morro Bay, which was basically an extension of the mission, and Morro Bay was the only harbor that was between Santa Barbara and Monterey, so this was pretty significant. When I've been doing my research on Alta California and the mission era and exploration, there's 2 names that I came across as far as people who were exploring by way of the sea, and that was Cabrillo, sailing along the coast in 1542, and he's naming stuff and he's writing things down or having a secretary write things down. And exactly 60 years later, Sebastian Vizcaíno also doing the same thing, naming many more of the landmarks, and by the way, his names tended to stick. But there was a name I came across very recently, Pedro de Unamuno, who was sailing around here in 1587. And when he was sailing in and around Morro Bay, he was describing the vast varieties and quantities of fish and the shellfish, and he was noting that there was plenty of water, drinkable water, okay, because he's looking at resupply, firewood, and he was noting that the trees that were growing in the area would be really good for replacement masts. Well, a little over 200 years later, Padre Martinez basically gets the lumbering or logging industry going in the area of Mission San Luis Obispo. Actually, what he does is he has people going into the Santa Lucia Mountains and bringing down the trees. And by 1813, trees were being shipped as far away, or lumber was being shipped as far away as Lima, Peru. So just another example of, you know, empires exploiting colonies for their resources. You got to use history to bust myths. And there was a very common myth that went around that the Spanish in Alta California and later the Mexicans who ran Alta California were not interested in the fur trade. And when you hear fur trade, you tend to think mountain men and Jedediah Smith and Jeremiah Johnson, and you know, no, that's not working, because there was another fur trade called the maritime fur trade to distinguish it from those guys up in the mountains. And the maritime fur trade tended to center along sea otter pelts, because sea otters had thicker fur, really desirable. And there was like an even triangle trade that grew up out of it that involved China, the United States, Britain, and also the Sandwich Islands were involved in this. So here's the myth, but there's the reality that, for instance, the Russians were sailing along the coast of Alta California, and for instance, when they went to the island of San Nicolas, you know, island of the Blue Dolphins fame, where they slaughtered the Nicoleños, they were there to get sea otter pelts. But this kind of gives you the idea, well, that's kind of like a foreign thing. The Spanish were not upset about the Nicoleño being slaughtered. They were upset because the Russians were poaching. And that led to some imprisonments and the martyrdom of one of the Aleuts who was doing the poaching. But Father Martinez up at San Luis Obispo, he's looking at an area that was like pretty ripe with sea otters. And so what he did is he trained the Chumash of the mission to go out and collect pelts. And these would end up being sold to the Russians. They were being sold to the Hudson Bay Company, or HBC, who ended up becoming the real big wheels in the maritime fur trade, as well as the other fur trade. So this was one more source of wealth that Father Martinez found for Mission San Luis Obispo. So, first video on Mission San Luis Obispo, basically building the mission. Second video is how the mission worked. Okay, we've done that. I got to do another video because we've got to get into all the high stress situations that happen with the mission. So I hope you stick with me on my journey.